You are a peasant mother in the French countryside, and the year is 1438. Your 6-year-old son has been missing for 3 days, and despite your desperate prayers, you know in your heart that he's never coming home. The other villagers whisper about the nobleman's castle on the hill, about the screams that echo from its towers at night, about children who vanish whenever the baron's men come recruiting for special service in his household. What terrifies you most isn't just that your child is gone. It's that the man responsible for his disappearance is celebrated throughout France as a holy warrior of God. Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, companion to the Blessed Joan of Arc, defender of the faith against English heretics. The same hands that once held sacred relics and blessed weapons now torture children in ways that would make demons weep with admiration. As you kneel in the village church, begging Christ for mercy, you don't know that your son died screaming in a ritual chamber beneath the baron's private chapel. You don't know that his blood was used to paint symbols on altar stones, stolen from consecrated churches. You don't know that his final moments were spent as entertainment for a man who had transformed from holy knight into a worshipper of darkness, dedicating his life to serving powers that Christianity forbids. What you're experiencing isn't an isolated tragedy. It's one thread in a tapestry of horror woven by a man who perverted religious devotion into systematic murder. Gilles de Rais didn't just kill children. He created elaborate theological justifications for his crimes, turning his castle into a monastery of Satan where torture became worship and death became sacrament. This isn't a story about a knight who fell from grace. It's the story of how a man who took monastic vows to serve God instead became history's most depraved killer. The warrior monk who once stood beside St. Joan would ultimately confess to crimes so horrific that his own judges wept while recording his testimony. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. To understand how Gilles de Rais transformed from holy warrior to child-killing monk, we must first understand the man he was before evil consumed him completely. Born in 1394 to one of France's most powerful noble families, Gilles inherited vast estates in Brittany that made him one of the wealthiest men in Europe. More importantly, he inherited a military tradition that valued courage, honor, and service to God above all earthly considerations. Young Gilles embodied everything medieval society admired in a warrior monk. He was tall, handsome, and possessed of remarkable physical courage that inspired loyalty in his soldiers and admiration from his peers. His education was extensive, including not just military training but intensive theological study, philosophy, and what passed for natural science in the 15th century. He could discuss scripture with learned priests and debate military strategy with experienced commanders. When Joan of Arc appeared at the French court claiming divine visions, Gilles was among the first nobles to support her cause. He fought beside her at the Siege of Orleans, where his bravery in breaking the English blockade earned him promotion to Marshal of France at the unprecedented age of 25. Contemporary accounts describe him charging into battle with religious fervor, believing he was fighting a holy war for God's chosen messenger. Joan herself trusted Gilles completely, often seeking his counsel on military matters and relying on his tactical expertise to implement her divinely inspired strategies. Their relationship was almost monastic in its intensity, two warriors dedicated to serving God through violence against his enemies. When she was captured by the English in 1430, Gilles reportedly wept openly and swore vengeance against her captors. Joan's execution in 1431 shattered something fundamental in Gilles' character. The woman he revered as a saint had been burned as a heretic by the very church they had fought to defend. If God could allow such injustice, if the church could murder his chosen messenger, then perhaps everything Gilles had believed about divine authority and moral order was a lie. The transformation began gradually. Gilles withdrew from court life, retreating to his remote castles where he adopted the lifestyle of a religious hermit. He spent increasing amounts of time in study and prayer, but the texts he collected promised supernatural knowledge rather than salvation. He began to see himself as a monk serving darker masters, convinced that if God had abandoned France, then perhaps other powers might be more reliable allies. What started as a crisis of faith would eventually mutate into something far more sinister. The warrior monk who had once protected the innocent was about to begin systematically destroying them in pursuit of powers that existed only in his increasingly twisted imagination. The first signs of Gilles's transformation appeared in 1435, when servants at his castle of Machecoul began reporting strange sounds from the basement chambers. Night after night, they heard chanting in languages they didn't recognize, accompanied by screams that seemed to come from children. When questioned, Gilles claimed he was conducting monastic studies into alchemical mysteries, research that required absolute secrecy and occasionally involved animals in distress. The truth was far more horrific. Gilles had begun kidnapping peasant children from surrounding villages, luring them to his castle with promises of employment as altar boys or scribes in his private chapel. Once inside his walls, these children discovered that their new master had uses for them that perverted every aspect of religious service. They were taken to chambers beneath the castle chapel, where Gilles conducted rituals he believed would grant him supernatural wealth and power. Gilles had convinced himself that murdering innocent children would please demons who could grant him unlimited gold and knowledge of the future. He developed elaborate rituals based on corrupted interpretations of Christian liturgy, using stolen, consecrated hosts and sacred vessels in ceremonies that perverted every element of the Mass. Where real monks offered bread and wine as symbols of Christ's sacrifice, this perverted monk offered the actual blood and flesh of murdered children. The basement chambers had been converted into a grotesque parody of a monastery. The walls were covered with stolen religious artifacts arranged in patterns that mimicked church decorations but served purposes that would have horrified any genuine priest. Gilles wore mock religious robes during his ceremonies, chanting corrupted Latin prayers while torturing his victims. The process typically began with psychological torture designed to increase the victim's terror. Children were told they were being prepared for a special religious ceremony, that their suffering would bring them closer to God. Gilles would force them to confess their sins while showing them instruments of torture, explaining in religious language how pain would purify their souls before death released them to heaven. The actual murders combined elements of sacrifice, torture, and sexual assault in ways that revealed the complete corruption of Gilles' once noble character. He would first violate the children, believing that destroying their innocence somehow enhanced the power of their death. Then he would torture them slowly, collecting their blood in consecrated chalices while chanting invocations to demons whose names he had learned from forbidden manuscripts. But the killing was only the beginning of each ceremony. Gilles would dismember the bodies, preserving certain organs in jars that he believed contained magical properties. He would paint symbols on the walls with the victim's blood, attempting to create what his books described as gates through which supernatural entities could enter the physical world. Sometimes he would keep the heads, claiming that the eyes of murdered innocents could see into the spirit realm. The disposal of evidence required an elaborate system that involved his most trusted servants. Bodies were burned in special furnaces designed to consume flesh and bone completely, leaving no trace that could be discovered by suspicious villagers or church investigators. Gilles threatened his servants with damnation if they revealed what they witnessed, using religious language to ensure their silence. As months passed, Gilles' appetite for murder intensified rather than diminished. The initial hope that a single sacrifice might grant him supernatural wealth gave way to belief that the demons required regular feeding to maintain their favor. Children began disappearing from villages throughout Brittany at an alarming rate, with some communities losing dozens of young people over the course of a single year. The Baron's reputation for religious devotion provided perfect cover for his crimes. When he offered to take poor families' children as altar boys or monastery servants, parents saw it as divine providence rather than mortal danger. When those children never returned home, Gilles would claim they had taken religious vows requiring complete separation from their families, or had died serving God in his private chapel. The psychological toll on Gilles himself was evident to those who knew him well. The cheerful, confident knight who had once inspired loyalty through his courage became paranoid, secretive, and prone to violent rages. His former friends noticed that he had adopted the mannerisms of a religious fanatic, speaking constantly about divine signs and demonic influences while avoiding normal human contact. Gilles de Rais' reign of terror was enabled by a feudal system that granted noble lords virtually unlimited power over their subjects' lives, combined with religious institutions that were too corrupted by political considerations to provide effective moral oversight. In 15th century France, peasant children had no legal protection against aristocratic predators, especially those who cloaked their crimes in religious language. The Catholic Church, which should have served as a moral check on noble excess, was itself compromised by its dependence on aristocratic patronage. Local priests relied on nobles like Gilles for their positions, and were reluctant to investigate rumors about their benefactors' activities. When peasant families brought concerns about missing children to church authorities, they were typically dismissed with explanations about God's mysterious will or suggestions that the families should be grateful their children were serving in a noble's private chapel. More insidiously, the Church's own teachings about supernatural evil provided Gilles with theological justification for his crimes. Medieval Christianity taught that demons were real entities who could grant earthly power to humans willing to serve them. The same religious authorities who condemned witchcraft and devil worship had created an intellectual framework that made such practices seem plausible to a man desperate for supernatural assistance. The monastic tradition itself contributed to Gilles' ability to operate without detection. Medieval monasteries were expected to maintain strict privacy, and their activities were rarely subject to outside scrutiny. When Gilles adopted the lifestyle and language of a religious hermit, it provided perfect cover for his criminal activities. His claims to be conducting theological research or performing religious penances explained away the strange sounds and secretive behavior that might otherwise have attracted investigation. French royal authority, weakened by the ongoing war with England, lacked the resources or motivation to investigate crimes committed by powerful nobles who provided military support for the crown. As long as Gilles continued to fulfill his obligations as Marshal of France, King Charles VII had little interest in examining rumors about his personal conduct. The crown needed aristocratic loyalty more than it needed justice for peasant children. The intellectual culture of the late medieval period also played a role in enabling Gilles' transformation from knight to killer. The Renaissance interest in classical learning had revived ancient texts on magic and demonology that provided detailed instructions for summoning supernatural entities. These manuscripts, often copied in monastery scriptoriums by monks who didn't understand their dangerous contents, circulated among educated nobles seeking esoteric knowledge. Perhaps most tragically, the trauma of Joan of Arc's execution created a crisis of faith that left Gilles vulnerable to alternative spiritual systems. When the Church murdered the woman he believed was a saint, it undermined his confidence in Christian moral authority and opened his mind to practices that he would have previously rejected as obviously evil. The human cost of Gilles' perverted monasticism becomes viscerally clear when we examine the fates of specific children who fell into his hands. Each victim represents not just individual tragedy, but the destruction of entire families who believed they were entrusting their children to a holy man's care. Consider the story of Poitou, a 10-year-old boy from the village of Saintes, Etienne de Montluc, who disappeared in the autumn of 1437. Poitou was the eldest son of a poor farming family, intelligent and deeply religious despite his youth. When Gilles' agents appeared in the village recruiting boys for service as altar boys in the Baron's private chapel, Poitou's parents saw it as an answer to their prayers. Their son would receive religious education, regular meals, and training that might elevate him to a position in the church. The recruitment process was carefully designed to inspire confidence in worried parents. Gilles' agents, dressed like monks, spoke in religious language, and provided detailed descriptions of the spiritual life their children would enjoy in the castle's monastery. They showed letters of recommendation from priests who vouched for the baron's piety and devotion. Parents were told their children would be taught to read Latin, study scripture, and serve God in ways that would guarantee their salvation. Poitou's final letter home, dictated to a scribe because he was still learning to write, described wonderful meals, warm clothing, and intensive religious instruction from the baron himself. His parents treasured this letter as proof that their sacrifice in sending him away was justified by his spiritual advancement. They had no way of knowing that Gilles forced his victims to send reassuring messages home as part of his psychological torture. The reality of Poitou's situation was a nightmare that began the moment he entered the castle gates. Along with 6 other boys recruited from different villages, he was taken to chambers beneath the main hall that had been converted into a grotesque parody of a monastery. The walls were covered with stolen religious artifacts, arranged in patterns that mimicked church decorations but served purposes that would have horrified any genuine priest. Gilles personally greeted each new group of victims, presenting himself as a kindly abbot who took special interest in their spiritual welfare. He would ask about their families, their hopes for religious advancement, and their knowledge of Scripture, gathering information he would later use to maximize their psychological suffering. The boys were given comfortable beds, excellent meals, and even small religious tokens that reinforced the illusion that they had indeed found benevolent religious instruction. The torture began gradually, disguised as religious discipline. Boys who asked when they might visit their families were told that such earthly attachments interfered with spiritual development. Those who expressed homesickness were isolated for prayer and fasting as punishment for insufficient devotion to God. Gradually, the comfortable accommodations gave way to locked cells, reduced rations, and punishments for spiritual infractions that seemed to multiply daily. Poitou's final weeks were spent in a state of terror that Gilles carefully cultivated through perverted religious instruction. The boy was forced to assist in preparing ritual chambers, not understanding what the candles, symbols, and strange artifacts were intended to accomplish. He was made to clean bloodstains from stone altars while being told they were sacred relics. Most cruelly, he was forced to watch as other boys disappeared one by one, always with explanations that they had achieved spiritual enlightenment and been translated directly to heaven. When Poitou's turn finally came, Gilles conducted the ritual with the methodical precision of a perverted religious ceremony. The boy was told that he had been chosen for the highest spiritual honor, that his sacrifice would please God and bring blessings to his family. Even as the torture began, Gilles continued to speak in religious language, describing the pain as purification and the approaching death as blessed martyrdom. Gilles' reign of terror finally ended in 1440, when the Duke of Brittany, pressured by mounting evidence and political necessity, ordered his arrest on charges of heresy, sodomy, and murder. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the medieval period, generating testimony so shocking that some records were sealed for centuries to protect public morality. The investigation revealed a network of complicity that extended throughout Gilles' household and into the broader feudal structure that had enabled his crimes. Servants who had participated in body disposal, clerks who had forged letters from victims, and even some local priests who had provided stolen consecrated hosts for his rituals were arrested alongside their master. The scope of institutional failure that had allowed over 140 children to disappear without serious investigation horrified even hardened medieval justice officials. Gilles' own testimony during the trial provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a perverted monk turned serial killer. He confessed not only to the murders but to the theological reasoning behind them, explaining in detail how he had convinced himself that torturing innocents would grant him supernatural wealth and power. His calm, methodical description of his crimes, delivered in the language of religious devotion, suggested a complete absence of normal human empathy. The Church's response revealed deep institutional anxieties about how one of their own could fall so completely into Satan's service. While condemning his actions as obviously evil, church leaders struggled to explain how a man who had dedicated himself to religious study could become history's most depraved killer. Some theologians suggested that his intense study of forbidden texts had opened his soul to demonic influence. The execution of Gilles de Rais in October 1440 was conducted with elaborate ceremony designed to demonstrate that justice had been served and divine order restored. But the deeper questions raised by his crimes, how religious institutions could fail so completely, how trusted spiritual authorities could abuse their power so systematically, remained largely unaddressed. Modern psychological analysis suggests that Gilles exhibited characteristics of psychopathy combined with grandiose religious delusions. His ability to maintain a facade of piety while privately committing horrific crimes demonstrates the danger posed by intelligent individuals who use religious authority to mask complete moral emptiness. The case established legal precedents for prosecuting religious figures who abuse their authority, but it also revealed how easily systems designed to protect the innocent could be manipulated by those who understood how to exploit religious trust and spiritual devotion. The children who died in his ritual chambers paid the ultimate price for their society's failure to protect the innocent from predators in positions of trust. Their voices, silenced by torture and death, still cry out across the centuries, demanding that we remember their suffering and learn from the institutional failures that enabled it. The castle walls that once echoed with screams have crumbled into ruins, but the questions they raise about religious authority, institutional accountability, and the protection of the vulnerable remain as urgent today as they were 6 centuries ago. In confronting the legacy of history's most perverted night, we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the corruption of spiritual power that no amount of progress can entirely eliminate. The only fitting memorial to Gilles' victims is our determination to ensure that such systematic evil never again finds shelter behind respected institutions and trusted religious authority. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.